Hello. Take a look at this, please. Take a look at this. I took this photo in 1988 in New York City at Central Park West and 76th Street. What this photo shows is the plight of the homeless. There's a man under those blankets, his belongings next to him, an I Love New York shopping bag near his head. This man is sleeping on the stoop of a building designed by William Stewart Potter in 1897 as the Universalist Unitarian building that has been included in the New York City Landmark Historic District that encompasses the entire block of 76th Street in New York City. A beautiful building, a distressing sight, a world of disparity contained in the photo. Can you see the trees of Central Park in the reflection of the window? We in America are fond of calling ourselves the richest, the greatest nation in the world. If that is so, why is homelessness so prevalent in America? Is Jacksonville different than New York when it comes to the plight of homeless? That is our topic for today. My name is Ken Hurley, and you're watching a program called Civil Discourse, sponsored by the American Civil Liberties Union of Greater Jacksonville, Florida. And two great people, experts on the topic of homelessness, are in the studio. Doug Orange, founder and executive director, formerly a homeless individual himself, of Empowerment First, an organization in Jacksonville, and many of the Jacksonville community are familiar with Wanda Lanier, the executive director of Emergency Services as a Homeless Coalition in Jacksonville. Thank you both for being here today. So, why is homeless so prevalent if we are the greatest and richest nation in the world? Wanda?
That is a great question. We are undoubtedly the richest nation in the country, in the world, and probably one of the richest states in the country and a very prosperous city. So one does have to ask oneself, why do we have such huge numbers of homeless people? There are about 3,000 homeless people today in our city, and last year there were over 18,000 men, women, and children who found themselves homeless. And the reason is very complex, and most of the time people want to blame the individual and say, why don't you go get a job or pull yourself up by the bootstraps? Mm-hmm. And that's not exactly the simple solution.
Right. This you say that, and I know Doug and I have some personal experience. This appeared in the Florida Times Union, something promoting the Clara White mission. But ever tempted to tell a homeless person to get a job? Try this before your next big job interview or presentation. Go to sleep on your driveway with nothing more than this newspaper as your pillow, blanket, and morning toilet paper, and then let us know how well that job interview went.
And make sure you have all your possessions on yourself so that when you go for the interview, they will know that you're homeless.
Doug, how do you define homelessness?
Define homelessness is people who don't have a place to live, people who are living on the street trying to put their lives together. And it's kind of interesting that Clara White took that perception, because that is, being homeless myself, that was one of the strongest and hardest things to do, was to go find a job during the time you were homeless. Because until there was a shelter open here in Jacksonville with unlimited nights, you had to stay here 3 nights, you had to stay here 5 nights, and you were carrying your stuff around. You can't very well do those things. Mm-hmm. And then you get caught into the trap of the labor pools, where you're working 8 hours a day and walking out with less than $20 a day. So I think that statement is very powerful in the way that, try this before you make this statement. Because these are people that are working, trying to get off the street, but they're still on the street. Mm-hmm. They're doing everything that society tells them to do, mm-hmm. and they're still homeless.
We've been working on the issue of homelessness, and I mean by we as a society, for probably as long as I've ever been alive, and you guys have been alive, but even before that. How are we doing? Is it trending upward or downward, or staying the same? Is the status quo of the number of homeless people on the street trending up, down, or staying the same?
Well, it's increasing pretty much at an alarming rate, Ken, in Jacksonville and around the country. In this country, we have over 3.5 million people who are homeless, living in shelters or on the street. And I remember 25 years ago when we talked about homeless people, there were a few people living on the street in the doorways of churches, and everyone thought that this problem was going to go away in a very short period of time. So we've built a system of emergency shelters and other kinds of programs and services that deal with people on a short-term basis. But in the meantime, what people really need is affordable housing and supports to help them kind of get off the street and be productive, and that's what most homeless people want.
In our definition of homelessness, we have something called first-time homeless people, right? Has that been trending upward as well? The number of people who claim to be first-timers?
Yes.
How about the people who are chronically homeless? Has that also been trending upward?
Well, the number of people who are first-time homeless definitely is increasing, and those are people who are like on the edge. They're the working poor. They're people working at minimum wage, sometimes 2 jobs, just to try to get by. And the first crisis that comes along, they have a health care crisis. They can't pay their medical bills. The rent goes up, utilities go up, their car breaks. Whatever the situation might be, they find themselves going over the edge and winding up in a shelter, or in some cases on the street, living in their car, whatever the case may be. But definitely that number in percent is increasing. And when we talk about chronically homeless people, those are the people that have been homeless a long period of time. And they are also, that number of people is also increasing because they are living in shelters and not getting the help they need. They're living on the street longer and longer. So it's kind of a cycle that just perpetuates itself.
In Fort Lauderdale, the ACLU was involved in a long battle with the city, the Fort Lauderdale Beach folks down there, and we created something called the Pottinger Settlement. Are you familiar with that? Which essentially said if there is no shelter available and people who are deemed homeless are performing life-sustaining functions in public, that they cannot be arrested for that. That's my short synopsis of a 14-year battle and ultimate settlement with the Fort Lauderdale Beach folks. When should homelessness be a crime?
Well, I don't know how Doug will answer that question, but I don't think homelessness itself should ever be a crime. If people are trying to do what normal people would do, they only happen to be on the street when they're doing it. You should never be arrested for being in a public place, obviously.
Just for being in a public place, not
just
for
being in a
creating
public place,
disturbance.
exactly.
Right.
But I think our sheriff's office does not go to that extent. But what happens is they respond to complaints from citizens, from business owners that homeless people are, urinating in their business way, in the park, whatever. So the police come and they
Urinating in the business way is not a public place, though.
That's
if they're
right.
on the
So they're
business.
trespassing.
Right,
And the
right.
number one crime for which homeless people are arrested in this city is trespassing. And in fact, we did a study of the sheriff's office a couple of years ago. We found that the city, the sheriff, is spending $5 million a year just to incarcerate homeless people, and the number one crime is trespassing.
Doug, what is your assessment of law enforcement relative to the arrests of homeless? Because we know they get arrested. Do you think there's fair treatment, or does it depend on the individual officer, depend on the mood, depend on the events that the city might be having? Is there a difference between Jacksonville and Jacksonville Beach?
I would say that yes, there is a difference between Jacksonville and Jacksonville Beach. Jacksonville Beach doesn't have a alternative to a shelter as far as I know in their ordinance. So I mean, if you're there and you're doing whatever they consider to be breaking the law, you're arrested or you're ticketed or whatever. Would I say Jacksonville Beach is worse than Jacksonville? Yeah, I would say that they are. I agree with Wanda on the fact that I don't believe that a homeless person should be arrested for sleeping in the park. I often have a theory that, if I'm standing in front of a window and I throw a brick through the window, I'm going to be arrested. If a homeless person standing in front of a window throws a brick through the window, he's going to be arrested. I believe that, people shouldn't be arrested for doing things, i.e. sleeping in the park when they have nowhere else to sleep.
You have an organization that you founded not too long ago, within the past 2 years or so, called Empowerment First. Why empowerment first? Why is that first?
Well, I believe that in my personal situation, I was homeless for about 5 years. And during that 5 years, I went through multiple programs. And most of the programs I went through were really good programs. Matter of fact, I spoke at a conference one time, and someone was there from the program, I believe it was the Salvation Army, and he walked up to me afterwards and he said, "Doug, what could my program have done better for you?" And I said nothing, because I wasn't ready at that point in time. I believe that Empowerment First is built on the foundation that people there are homeless, not in all cases do they choose to be there, but in some cases they choose to remain there because they don't see anything better for themselves. I think by taking these people and getting them involved through different projects that Empowerment First is able to do, you help build that self-esteem and help build that support system within themselves, which helps them to do the things that they need to do to become independent, hopefully. I can remember as a case manager one time, I was meeting with my case manager and he asked me, he said, Doug, what do you need most to not be homeless? And I looked at him, I said, I need a girlfriend. And he kind of laughed like you did. He said, okay, let me follow this through. Doug, why do you need a girlfriend? I said, because I need someone to believe in me. And I believe that homeless people, as a rule, need someone to believe in themselves.
You know why I laugh? Because I know people who have girlfriends who got kicked out and became homeless as a result of their girlfriend.
There you go. But I believe that, you know, at that point in my life, I needed someone to believe in me because I didn't have that support system. You know, I was homeless. I became homeless because my father passed away. He died in a car accident. And me and my mother really didn't have a good relationship. So at that point in my life, I felt like I was alone. And I just needed somebody to believe in me. And every place I wanted to go and every shelter I went to, they were like, we're going to figure you out. And I was like, how are you going to figure me out when I can't even figure myself out?
So you wanted them to teach somehow ownership of responsibility, stewardship of their own life.
Correct.
Give them some direction and sense of purpose in their life.
Correct.
If empowerment is first, what's second?
Housing.
Housing. Would you agree with that, Wanda?
Well, I've always said housing is first because that is empowering. But Doug has a good point. The one thing that homeless people have in common, and if there are 3,000 homeless people in Jacksonville today, there are 3,000 stories about why they're homeless. The one thing they have in common is a sense of hopelessness. That when you reach that far down, you think there is no way up, that nobody cares, that there is no life better than you have today for tomorrow. So Doug does have a very good point about that. But I'm a firm believer that affordable housing is the most important thing that people need. That it's the way that people identify themselves in the community. It's who they are, having a home. That is very empowering just in and of itself.
Now, there's lots of ways that people can get housing, and we're talking now, I think, about permanent housing. But there's also lots of transitional housing that you are very familiar with and have some sort of oversight or some sort of coalition in terms of emergency services and homeless coalition in Jacksonville. We have Jacksonville Housing Authority, the Schulzbacher Center, Volunteers of America, Florida, Community Connections, which I think is formerly the YWCA, River Region Human Services, Mental Health Resource Center, Goodwill, Clara White Mission, Youth Crisis Center, United Way of Northeast Florida. Do all of those organizations and agencies offer housing?
No, they don't all offer housing. We fund sort of a continuum of services from outreach, street outreach, where people go out on the street and try to address the needs of people who are mentally ill primarily, all the way to permanent housing. And in between, there are other kinds of services like employment services, but also short-term or transitional housing. So that kind of gives people an opportunity to have access to affordable housing and supportive services so that within a couple of years, they can move on to permanent housing.
We're getting ready to take a break. We're going to take a short break. When we come back, I want to ask you, what happens when the transitional shelters are filled? Where do those folks go? What happens during the holiday season? Do you see an increase in the number of homeless individuals? What can we do better? What can we get better at? And let's talk a little bit more about the chronically ill and some of the attributes that these people seem to have, and what can we do to help. My name is Ken Hurley. You're watching a program called Civil Discourse, sponsored by the American Civil Liberties Union of Greater Jacksonville, Florida. Take a look at these messages. We'll be right back.
This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine.
In these turbulent times, let us not erode the liberties our country was built on.
Let it shine.
Larry Parker, National Honor Society student. Patricia Stevenson, stockbroker. Victor Desario, Systems Analyst. Driving while black or brown isn't a crime. If it's happened to you, call us at 1-8776-PROFILE and arrest the racism.
Welcome back to Civil Discourse. My name is Ken Hurley. We're here with Wanda Lanier, the Executive Director of the Emergency Services and Homeless Coalition of Jacksonville, and Doug Orange, the Executive Director and founder of Empowerment First. And Wanda, I want to ask you, and Doug, you chime in on this too, what happens when the shelters are all filled and there's still homeless people that want to go to a shelter?
Well, Ken, that happens every single day. The shelters are filled beyond capacity, and pretty much people are forced out on the street. We have about 600 or 700 people every day who are living on the street in Jacksonville, in Duval County.
Wow. So they want to go to the shelter, and they're actually turned away, no room at the inn.
Exactly.
And they have to, do they just congregate, let's say outside underneath the bridge overpass or the Hart Expressway, whatever that's called, over the Schulzbach Center? Can they stay out in front of the parking lot? Is that where
they tend to do that, I think, quite a bit, but they're looking for any place they can where they'll be safe.
Are there people who have been to a shelter who don't want to go back, Doug? You spent some time in shelters, right?
Yes.
What's your assessment of the shelter programs?
There's always people that go to the shelter and and people that don't want to go to the shelter. There's different reasons why people don't want to go to the shelter. They could not want to go to the shelter because they don't want to be confined within a space. They don't want to, follow the rules of the organization or something like that. But there is always people that don't want to go to the shelter. Those people are usually the people that we find that are sleeping out in the different camps and stuff like that, in the different areas and in the parks. Along with the people that can't get in the shelter who want to get in the shelter. An interesting statistic, I believe, is that, as Wanda spoke about earlier, there's 3,000 homeless people here in Jacksonville, roughly. Out of that, I think we have probably, a fraction of the shelter beds. And if you look at across the nation, it's that way. There's never enough shelter beds to handle all the people that are homeless.
So what do we do?
Well,
is the answer to build more shelters?
I almost disagree with that to some extent. I think what we've learned over a period of a year or so studying this issue is not that we don't have enough shelter beds. It's that we don't have enough affordable housing, so when people are ready to leave the shelters, they have a place to go where they can afford to live.
What is affordable housing?
Well, it's housing. When we talk about affordable housing, we're talking about people usually at a lower income level, and they will be able to afford to pay 30% of their income for rent or housing. Well, most lower income people are paying 50% or more, and a lot of times they can't even find the housing to begin with. So we did I think we looked at the housing market in Jacksonville. A one-bedroom is like about $600 a month, what's called fair market rent on the market. And if you're making minimum wage, you need to be working 2 jobs to be able to afford that. So there's not enough housing, apartments or home ownership, whatever, at a level in which people who are making minimum wage are even a little bit higher.
Some of our major construction firms in town are probably not going to be interested in building what you call affordable housing because the money isn't in it for them. They're in business. So who is left to build the affordable housing? Where do we turn when we want to help those in need?
Well, and that's a very good question. Affordable housing, the way it's designed, which can carry very little debt, does not produce a great profit, if any. So for-profit developers don't typically want to do this. It's pretty much left to nonprofit developers to do it, and sometimes it takes 3 to 5 years to put all the financing together to make one project happen.
Habijacks is one of the premier groups of people who do this exact
Absolutely,
work.
and they have huge volunteers and donations, and they've got it down to a science. But the waiting list is huge for Habijacks. But the other thing is, and something we've recommended locally, is something called inclusionary zoning, which works very well in other cities. And that is when a for-profit developer or any developer wants to go build an apartment complex, then in order for him to get approved for that particular project, he or she needs to set aside a certain number of units for low to moderate income people. And it sort of solves 2 problems. You don't isolate low-income people in one part of the community or a neighborhood, they become included in the overall community. They get access to good schools, good shopping, parks, the whole gamut.
Is there resistance to this?
Well, there would be from developers, I'm sure.
Is this something that City Council has to get involved in terms of
It would-
zoning?
Right.
Have you lobbied our City Council in Jacksonville regarding this?
We haven't lobbied them specifically on this issue, but we just completed a 10-year plan, and that is very much included as one of the public policy
Is that plan
issues.
the blueprint to end homelessness? Is that what
Yes.
we're calling that? Everybody has a blueprint these days
Yeah,
to,
they
and to do
do.
something.
I wish we were the
Blueprint for prosperity,
Yeah.
blueprint to end homelessness.
Well, we completed our blueprint a year ago, almost a year ago.
Is this
And
part of that work?
That's a report that led up to it. But the blueprint is a 10-year plan that pretty much lays out what we as a community will need to do over the next 10 years to pretty much eliminate or at least significantly reduce our homeless population.
Well, I want to get to that. What can we do? But I want to ask Doug a question is, what do we do when we see homeless folks on the streets? I notice a lot of people, we'll be walking down a street and we'll say, come on, honey, let's cross the street. We don't want to go down there. There's bums there. How do you respond to that? First of all, do you agree that that's an assessment that happens? Is that part of reality?
I agree with the concept that you're presenting, that people are more likely to walk away from a homeless person than they are
Why are
towards a
people
homeless
afraid?
person. They're afraid because they consider that person dirty, or they consider that person less of a person than they are.
Less of a person.
Less of a person than they are, where they're at that point in time. I think what society does as a rule is they judge homelessness by what they see on the streets, by the person sleeping in the park or something like that. They don't realize that 1 out of every 4 people that are homeless is a child. They don't see that. And I think that I think in some ways they're kind of afraid to see that, because if they saw it, they might understand homelessness more, I think is my opinion. But I think people do walk away from it because they see it as something that's less than them.
Now, in your work, you would physically go out on the streets looking for homeless people, right? Or do you go to other agencies and do your projects and your speeches?
Yeah,
and
we
your,
do other projects and stuff like that at different
in
agencies.
the other agencies.
Correct.
In your work, Wanda, do you actually go on the streets looking for homeless? How do you do a census of homeless if you don't actually get out there on the streets?
Oh, we do. We send an army of volunteers out 1 day a year, usually in January. They go out and count people on the street. They count them in the shelters. And so that we've been doing that since, I think, 1987.
Wanda, you've written that the current system is not keeping up with the demands for shelter and other services, and that the current system is costly and ineffective, especially in addressing the needs of people who have substantial multiple barriers, those who are mentally ill, substance addicted, and or long-term homelessness. What can we get better at? You've mentioned empowerment, giving stewardship to individuals. You've mentioned housing. What about jobs? What about job training, more shelters, counseling, education? How do we get better at it? What does the blueprint contain?
Well, the blueprint for the people who are really long-term homeless or mentally ill, and that's a fairly significant portion of the population, but even though they represent about 1/5 of the overall population, they use about 50% of the resources. And what we know to be a fact is that people who are mentally ill need stable housing that they can afford with supportive services, and they can get out of the shelters, off of the street. It can be done very effectively. It works elsewhere in the country very effectively.
But don't you need political leadership to implement this plan?
Well, the blueprint is pretty much a 3-pronged approach, preventing people from becoming homeless to begin with by helping people who are in crisis with financial assistance to keep them in their housing. And secondly, people who do become homeless in the shelters, get them out of the shelters as quickly as possible. We have people living in the Sulzbacher Center for 2 years right now. A shelter is no place for anyone to have to live more than 30 or 90 days. So we want to get them out of the shelter, but that requires having housing they can afford, some rent and other kinds of deposit assistance to get them in there, and then supportive services to help them for about 6 months so they can find a job and get back on their feet, and then building 800 units of housing. So yes, It requires a lot of buy-in
I
from
said
public
political
officials.
leadership. Who out there in the political landscape of Jacksonville is taking this as a point cause for themselves? Is there anyone on city council? Is the mayor getting beyond? I mean, I know people want to talk about it, and we all care for the homeless folks when the issue is put in front of us. But when it comes time to actually putting money on the table and saying we're going to do something now, who is doing that?
No one has put money on the table yet. I know that Kevin Hyde, President Kevin Hyde, is very committed to this issue. The city has faced a tough budget year, so there really was an opportunity this year for any kind of funding. But we did present the blueprint, the 10-year plan, to the mayor a year ago.
How has he responded?
We're waiting for his endorsement of the plan.
For in a year's time? Well, he's busy.
We're waiting for his endorsement and for some for a plan about how this can be implemented.
Are you in discussions with him?
Yes,
Okay.
his office.
So there's still communication going on. It's not like you handed him a plan and
No.
it's just been sitting there.
Right.
You're in communication with him, which is good. Now we have, you mentioned earlier, 3,000 homeless people regularly on the streets of Jacksonville, and also 3,000 people from Katrina and Rita, the disasters, the natural disasters on the Gulf Coast, have brought another group of homeless people here. How do you see our reaction to that versus to our reaction to the people already here? Doug? Wanda?
Well, that's a very good question, because we have had about 3,000 people relocate from Alabama, Mississippi to Jacksonville. And Jacksonville is one of the highest concentration of Katrina victims. The city has come together very effectively to address that, but we're still waiting for our community to address the current
There's so
people.
much more, Wanda, we have to talk about regarding this. Doug, I hope both of you will consider coming back so we can follow up on this, because we're talking now about FEMA people who have 18 months to live in HUD housing, and what happens when there's no homes? What happens at the end of that 18 months? We're watching a program called Civil Discourse. My name is Ken Hurley. We're always rushed at the end. I'm glad you're part of the ACLU and what we're trying to do here. Thank you very much for the work that you both are doing. We'll see you next time.
You have been watching a public access television program called Civil Discourse, sponsored by the American Civil Liberties Union of Greater Jacksonville, Florida. The ACLU is a private, nonprofit, nonpartisan membership organization. Our mission is to protect and advance the civil liberties and civil rights guaranteed by the United States Constitution, especially the principles contained in the Bill of Rights. We want to hear from you. Send us an email, share your views and opinions. If you're interested in appearing on the program, let us know. Friend or foe, we want you on the show. You may contact the ACLU in the following ways. Our telephone number is 904-396-5242. Our post office box is 5331 Jacksonville, Florida 32247. And our email address is aclujax@yahoo.com. My name is Ken Hurley. Thank you for participating in Civil Discourse.